Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Daniel Adegbite was 25 years old when he met Elizabeth Adedeji in the small bustling town of Olumide. She was only 15, but life had already burdened her with the kind of responsibilities that made her seem far older. Orphaned at a young age, Elizabeth lived with a distant aunt who treated her as nothing more than cheap labor. She was a fragile girl with big dreams and an unwavering spirit, and it was this strength that first drew Daniel to her. Daniel too knew hardship. Raised by a widowed mother who struggled to feed her 3 sons, he had learned to fend for himself early on. As an apprentice mechanic, his days were long and grueling, but he kept a quiet hope alive in his heart. Meeting Elizabeth was like a spark in his dim world. Her laughter, even in the face of her pain, was a reminder that joy could still be found in the simplest moments. Their friendship blossomed into a romance that defied the odds. Despite the whispers and judgment from their neighbors about their 10-year age gap, Daniel and Elizabeth clung to each other. He promised to take care of her, and she believed in his ability to build a better future for them. Elizabeth's youthful optimism and Daniel's steadfast determination became the foundation of their relationship. When Elizabeth turned 17, their love story took an unexpected turn. She became pregnant. The news sent shockwaves through their community, and Elizabeth's aunt wasted no time in disowning her. Left with no choice, she moved in with Daniel, who had barely enough to support himself. Their rented room in the crowded streets of Olumide was tiny, with peeling paint and a leaky roof, but they made it their home. In the months leading up to the birth of their daughter, Hilda, Daniel worked tirelessly. He picked up odd jobs during the day and repaired broken-down vehicles late into the night. Elizabeth contributed by taking in sewing work, stitching dresses for the women in their neighborhood. Yet, despite their efforts, there were days when they went to bed hungry, their stomachs aching but their hearts full of love. The birth of Hilda brought both joy and new challenges. The cries of their newborn filled their home, a constant reminder of the life they had created together. But with joy came the relentless weight of responsibility. Diapers, baby clothes, and hospital bills, they quickly realized that love alone couldn't pay the bills. Months turned into years and their struggles didn't ease. Yet through it all, Daniel and Elizabeth remained hopeful. They spoke often of their dreams, owning a small house, sending Hilda to school, and one day living without fear of unpaid rent or empty plates. But life seemed determined to test them. Their second daughter, Felicia, was born just as things took a turn for the worse. The mechanic shop where Daniel worked shut down without warning, leaving him jobless. They fell behind on rent, and Elizabeth had to take on more sewing jobs, often working late into the night while caring for 2 young children. Through all of this, their love remained their anchor. Elizabeth, though weary, never stopped smiling for her children. Daniel, though burdened, never stopped believing he could turn their fortune around. Their lives were hard, but their hearts were full. Little did they know, the challenges they faced now were only the beginning. As their story unfolded, the love that had once been their strength would be tested in ways they could never have imagined. Years passed in the crowded streets of Olumide, and the Adegbite family's struggles deepened. Daniel, once a symbol of strength and hope for Elizabeth, seemed to be losing his grip. He spent endless days searching for stable work, only to return home with empty hands and a heart full of guilt. Elizabeth, meanwhile, carried the weight of the family on her slender shoulders. Her sewing business barely covered their needs, and with Hilda now attending school, the expenses only grew. But then, as if fate had grown tired of tormenting them, an opportunity arose. Daniel's old friend Kunle reached out with a job offer in Obale, a city several hours away from Olumide. The position was as a factory supervisor, a steady job with a good salary. It was a lifeline, and for the first time in years, Daniel felt the stirrings of hope. The decision to move was not easy. Elizabeth hesitated, worried about uprooting the children and leaving behind the small support network they had in Olumide. But Daniel's enthusiasm was infectious, and his promises were hard to resist. "This is our chance, Lizzie," he said one night, his eyes alight with determination. "I can give you and the girls the life you deserve." So they packed little they owned and moved to a cramped apartment in Oberley. The city was a far cry from the familiarity of Olumide. The streets buzzed with activity, the air thick with the smell of industry. It was overwhelming, but Elizabeth clung to Daniel's optimism. At first, the change seemed to work in their favor. Daniel excelled at his job, and his first paycheck was enough to cover their rent, buy groceries, and even leave a little for savings. For the first time in years, Elizabeth allowed herself to dream again. She envisioned a brighter future for her daughters, a life where they wouldn't have to struggle as she had. But as the months went by, cracks began to form in their newfound happiness. Daniel started working longer hours, often coming home late. When Elizabeth questioned him, he brushed her off with excuses about overtime and work stress. She wanted to believe him, but the distant look in his eyes and the faint smell of alcohol on his breath told another story. Then came the nights he didn't come home at all. Elizabeth would sit by the window, her sewing untouched, listening for the sound of his footsteps on the stairwell. Her heart ached with worry, but she kept silent, afraid of pushing him further away. The final blow came one evening when a neighbor casually mentioned seeing Daniel at a local bar with a woman. Elizabeth's heart sank. Confronting him felt impossible. What if it only made things worse? But the doubts gnawed at her, eroding the trust they had spent years building. Despite her growing suspicions, Elizabeth tried to hold the family together. She poured her energy into her daughters, ensuring they had everything they needed. But no amount of love and effort could shield them from the tension that now hung heavy in their home. As Daniel drifted further away, Elizabeth was left to wonder, was this the man who had once promised to build a life with her? And if so, what had gone so terribly wrong? She didn't know it yet, but the worst was still to come. Elizabeth's decision to leave Daniel was not one she made lightly. For years she had endured his late nights, his cold indifference, and the sting of betrayal, all for the sake of their daughters. But the attack at Bose's house was the breaking point. She could no longer justify staying in a place where her dignity and safety were constantly at risk. Her daughters deserved a stable home, free from fear and humiliation. The morning after her declaration, Elizabeth began packing. Her movements were slow and deliberate as she folded the few clothes they owned and placed them into an old worn-out bag. Hilda watched silently, her wide eyes filled with confusion. "Mama, where are we going?" she asked. Elizabeth knelt beside her, tears pooling in her eyes. "Somewhere safe, my child, somewhere we can be happy again." Daniel, however, refused to accept her decision. As she packed, he hovered in the doorway, pleading and promising to change. "Elizabeth, I was wrong," he said, his voice thick with desperation. "Please don't take my children away from me." But Elizabeth stood her ground. "You've had years to change, Daniel," she replied, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "This time I'm choosing myself and my children." With the help of a kind neighbor, Elizabeth and her daughters moved into a small room at the edge of the town of Ireli. It wasn't much, just a single bed, a rickety table, and a cracked window that let in the cool evening breeze. But it was a start. Elizabeth resumed her sewing business, working tirelessly to provide for Hilda and Felicia. Though their new life was far from perfect, it was free from the shadows of Daniel's neglect and abuse. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt a sense of peace. She watched as her daughters laughed and played without fear of their father's outbursts. She found strength in their smiles and determination in their innocence. Slowly she began to heal, her bruises fading and her spirit rekindling. But Daniel was not one to let go so easily. 2 months after Elizabeth's departure, he arrived at her doorstep with elders from the community. The sight of him brought a rush of emotions, anger, sadness, and a sliver of the love she once had for him. The elders spoke of forgiveness and unity, urging Elizabeth to return home for the sake of her family. Daniel knelt before her, tears streaming down his face. "Elizabeth, I can't live without you," he said, his voice trembling. "I'll change, I promise. Please give me another chance. Elizabeth's heart wavered. She had loved him once, deeply and unconditionally, and for a moment she allowed herself to hope that perhaps this time he meant it. For the sake of her daughters and the life they had once dreamed of, she agreed to return. The first few weeks back were blissful. Daniel kept his promises, treating Elizabeth with the kindness and respect she had longed for. He spent time with their daughters, making them laugh and filling their home with a warmth that had been missing for years. But as the weeks turned into months, the old Daniel began to resurface. The late nights returned, along with the drinking and the anger. Elizabeth found herself trapped once more, her fragile hope crumbling under the weight of his broken promises. One fateful night, Daniel's rage reached a boiling point. Accusing Elizabeth of disrespecting him, he beat her until she collapsed. The neighbors rushed her to the hospital, her daughters sobbing in the arms of a kind stranger. It was there that the doctors delivered the devastating news. Elizabeth had suffered a stroke from years of abuse and stress. Elizabeth lay on the hospital bed, motionless, her once vibrant spirit reduced to a shadow of itself. Her body was frail, her face pale, and her once bright eyes stared blankly at the ceiling. The stroke had left her paralyzed on one side, and she struggled to speak, her words slurred and barely audible. The woman who had carried the weight of her family for so long was now utterly dependent on others. Hilda and Felicia sat by her bedside, their young faces etched with fear and confusion. Hilda, now 10, tried to be brave for her sister, but tears streamed down her cheeks as she held her mother's limp hand. Felicia, too young to fully understand, clung to her sister, her tiny fingers clutching Hilda's shirt. Daniel stood at the door, unable to step inside. The sight of Elizabeth, broken and vulnerable, filled him with a guilt so heavy it threatened to crush him. His mind replayed the years of neglect and abuse, each memory a stab to his conscience. He had promised to protect her, to build a life with her, and he had failed. The doctors were grim in their prognosis. She suffered a severe stroke, one of them explained to Daniel. The damage is extensive, likely caused by prolonged stress and trauma. We'll do our best, but her recovery will be slow, and she may never regain full mobility. Daniel nodded, his throat tight. He knew the truth. This wasn't just a medical condition, it was the culmination of years of pain he had inflicted on her. And now she was paying the price. The weeks that followed were a nightmare. Elizabeth remained in the hospital, her condition barely improving. Daniel visited daily, bringing flowers and sitting silently by her side, but she rarely acknowledged him. Her once warm eyes now held only a distant, haunted look. The children, too, grew distant from their father, their young hearts unable to reconcile the man they loved with the one who had hurt their mother. One evening, as Daniel sat by Elizabeth's bedside, he tried to apologize. "Lizzie," he began, his voice trembling, "I'm so sorry. I don't know how I became this man. You deserve better, better than me, better than the life I gave you." Elizabeth turned her head slowly to face him. Her lips moved, but the words were barely audible. "Too late," she whispered, her voice a ghost of what it once was. Tears streamed down Daniel's face as he realized the depth of her pain and how irreparable the damage truly was. Despite the doctor's efforts, Elizabeth's condition worsened. The stroke had taken a toll on her already fragile body, and the emotional scars of her life weighed heavily on her spirit. 3 months after being admitted to the hospital, she passed away in the early hours of the morning, surrounded by her daughters and a nurse. Daniel arrived minutes too late. When he saw her lifeless body, he collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him with regret. "Elizabeth," he cried, his voice breaking, "please come back, please." But she was gone. The woman who had loved him unconditionally, who had endured so much for the sake of their family, was gone forever. The funeral was a quiet affair, held in the small town of Ireli, where Elizabeth had found brief peace. As her body was lowered into the ground, Hilda and Felicia clung to each other, their tears soaking into the fabric of their dresses. Daniel stood apart from the crowd, his head bowed in shame. He knew he had no right to mourn her, not after all he had done. But the torment was only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Daniel found himself alone in the home they had once shared. The silence was deafening. each room a painful reminder of Elizabeth's absence. His daughters refused to speak to him, their hearts hardened by the years of pain he had caused their mother. Daniel tried to find solace in his work, but the guilt was inescapable. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Elizabeth's face, not as it had been in her final days, but as it was when they first met. Young, hopeful, and full of love. The days after Elizabeth's funeral were agonizing for Daniel. Every corner of their home reminded him of her, the faint smell of her favorite lotion lingering in the bedroom, the unfinished sewing projects left in the corner, and the soft giggles of their daughters that now carried an edge of sorrow. The once chaotic house was now suffocatingly silent, filled with memories that refused to fade. Daniel tried to reach out to his daughters, desperate to rebuild what was left of his family. Hilda, now 10, had taken on a protective role for Felicia, shielding her younger sister from the man she now viewed as a monster. Each time Daniel approached, Hilda would glare at him, her small frame radiating defiance. "You don't deserve to talk to us," she snapped one evening when Daniel tried to hand her a plate of food. Her words stung, cutting deeper than he expected. "Mama is gone because of you. You did this. You killed her." Daniel froze, the plate trembling in his hands. He wanted to argue, defend himself, but deep down he knew she was right. He had failed Elizabeth, and in doing so he had failed his daughters too. At night the weight of his guilt became unbearable. He often woke up drenched in sweat, haunted by nightmares of Elizabeth's lifeless body. Her voice echoed in his mind, reminding him of every broken promise, every cruel word, every missed chance to make things right. The memories played on a loop, tormenting him relentlessly. Desperate for redemption, Daniel decided to visit Elizabeth's grave. The small cemetery in Irele was a quiet, somber place, with rows of simple headstones shaded by tall trees. Daniel knelt before her grave, the words etched on the stone blurring through his tears. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice cracking. "I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm sorry. I failed you in every way a man can fail. You gave me love, patience, and a family, and I repaid you with pain. I don't know how to fix this, or if I even deserve to." The wind rustled through the trees, offering no response. Daniel stayed there for hours, pouring out his regrets, hoping that somehow Elizabeth could forgive him, even if he couldn't forgive himself. Back at home, Hilda and Felicia were grappling with their own grief. Hilda, though just a child, understood the permanence of their loss. She watched over Felicia, who often cried herself to sleep, clutching a worn-out scarf that had belonged to their mother. Hilda longed for comfort but refused to seek it from Daniel. In her eyes, he was the villain who had stolen their mother's life. As weeks turned into months, Daniel made countless attempts to reach his daughters. He cooked their meals, helped with their schoolwork, and even stopped drinking entirely. But his efforts were met with cold silence. To Hilda and Felicia, his gestures felt like too little, too late. One afternoon, Daniel overheard Hilda speaking to Felicia. "When we're old enough, we'll leave," she said, her voice firm. "We don't need him. Mama would want us to be strong." The words pierced Daniel's heart. He realized then that he couldn't force his daughters to forgive him. They had every right to hate him, every right to walk away. But he wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Determined to honor Elizabeth's memory, Daniel made a vow to himself. He would do whatever it took to make amends, even if it meant spending the rest of his life trying. He didn't just want forgiveness, he wanted to become the father his daughters deserved, the man Elizabeth had believed he could be. But deep down, he feared it might already be too late. Daniel poured every ounce of his energy into becoming a better father, but the void Elizabeth's death left in their family seemed impossible to fill. Hilda and Felicia barely acknowledged his presence, their young faces hardened by grief and anger. Every attempt to connect with them was met with cold indifference or outright rejection. One evening, Daniel decided to take a bold step. He entered the girls' room, his hands trembling. Hilda looked up from the book she was pretending to read, her sharp eyes narrowing at him. Felicia sat quietly on the bed, hugging the scarf that had belonged to their mother. "I know I failed you," Daniel began, his voice breaking. "I know I hurt your mother, and because of that I hurt both of you too. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to know." I love you. I'm trying to change for you, for Mama. Hilda slammed her book shut. Love? You don't know what love is, she spat. If you loved Mama, she'd still be here. If you loved us, you wouldn't have done what you did. Daniel's heart shattered, but he didn't walk away. He knelt before his daughters, tears streaming down his face. You're right, he admitted. I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I promise I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be the father you deserve. Even if you hate me, I'll never stop trying. The raw vulnerability in his voice seemed to shake something in Felicia. She looked at her older sister, her young eyes questioning. Hilda remained silent, her lips pressed into a thin line, refusing to show any weakness. The following weeks were a slow, painful process of rebuilding. Daniel threw himself into his daughters' lives, attending every school meeting, helping with homework, and ensuring they had everything they needed. He gave up his nights to work extra shifts, saving every penny to secure a better future for them. Despite his efforts, the girls' trust was a fortress he couldn't breach. Hilda especially refused to let him in. Her resentment festered like an open wound, growing more potent with each passing day. He's just pretending, she told Felicia one night. He'll never change, Mama believed him, and look what happened. But Felicia wasn't as sure. At 8 years old, her memories of Daniel's cruelty were already beginning to blur. She noticed the way he flinched at every harsh word, the way he tirelessly worked to make their lives better. Part of her wanted to believe that he could change, but she couldn't bring herself to say it aloud. Loyalty to Hilda kept her silent. One day Daniel decided to visit the church Elizabeth had attended before their move to Oberley. It was a modest building, but it had been a source of strength for her during their hardest times. Kneeling at the altar, Daniel prayed for guidance. God, I don't know if I deserve another chance, he whispered, but I need to be better for them. Please help me. As he left the church, he ran into Mama Abeni, the kind neighbor who had supported Elizabeth during her struggles. She looked at him with a mix of pity and disdain. You have a long road ahead, Daniel, she said. But if you truly want to honor Elizabeth, don't just say you'll change. Show them. Those words stayed with him. From that day, Daniel's resolve hardened. He began volunteering at the girls' school, showing up to support them at every opportunity. He sought counseling for his anger and drinking issues, determined to become a man worthy of their respect. But even as he made progress, the shadow of his past loomed large. The girls remained distant, and Daniel knew that forgiveness, if it ever came, would be a long time coming. The weight of Elizabeth's death lingered like an unshakable shadow over Daniel's life. Despite his efforts to make amends, his daughters Hilda and Felicia never forgave him. They grew into strong, resilient women, carrying the memory of their mother as a source of strength and purpose. But for Daniel, that memory became a relentless reminder of his failures. Years passed, and Daniel's once youthful features were replaced with deep lines of sorrow and regret. He lived alone in the same small apartment where Elizabeth had spent her final days, the walls filled with echoes of her laughter and the soft voices of his daughters when they were children. He kept her sewing machine untouched as a painful memento of the woman who had given him everything. Hilda, now in her 20s, had become a lawyer fiercely advocating for women's rights. Her drive was fueled by her mother's story, a woman who had endured years of abuse, only to lose her life to it. She refused to let others suffer the same fate, but her work came at a cost. Every courtroom victory was a reminder of the father she could not forgive. Felicia, on the other hand, had become a nurse. She devoted her life to caring for others, finding solace in healing where her mother's wounds had gone untreated. Yet despite her gentle demeanor, she harbored a quiet anger toward Daniel. She avoided speaking about him, even to Hilda, burying her feelings under layers of professionalism and compassion. Daniel tried to reach out to them over the years, sending letters that often went unanswered and leaving messages they never returned. Birthdays, graduations, and holidays passed without them, the silence growing heavier with each passing year. He attended Hilda's law school graduation from a distance, hiding in the back of the crowd as she accepted her degree. He wept silently, proud of her accomplishments, yet painfully aware of the distance between them. As time went on, Daniel's health began to fail. His years of heavy drinking and the toll of his guilt left him frail and weak. Alone in his apartment, he often spoke to Elizabeth's photograph, his voice trembling with regret. "Lizzie," he would whisper, "I've lost them. I've lost everything. I hope wherever you are, you can forgive me." One day, a letter arrived for Hilda and Felicia. It was Daniel's final attempt to reconcile. Written in shaky handwriting, it was a plea for forgiveness. The letter: "My dear daughters, I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, and I will never stop regretting the pain I caused your mother and both of you. I failed as a husband and as a father, and for that I will carry this guilt for the rest of my life. But I want you to know that I love you more than words can express. Your mother would be so proud of the women you've become, strong, kind, and courageous. If this is the last letter I ever write, let it be a promise. I will spend every remaining moment honoring your mother's memory. I will not ask you to forget, but I hope one day you can find it in your hearts to forgive. Forever yours, Papa." The letter went unread for months. When Daniel passed away quietly in his sleep, the news reached Hilda and Felicia through a distant relative. Though neither of them attended his funeral, Hilda found the letter while sorting through her belongings one rainy evening. She read it with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face. Felicia joined her, her own tears falling silently. For the first time in years, they spoke openly about their father, not with forgiveness, but with a quiet acknowledgement of the complexity of love, pain, and loss. Daniel died alone, burdened by his mistakes, but his story became a lesson for his daughters, a reminder of the importance of accountability, the irreparable cost of neglect, and the enduring strength of those who survive. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.